One of the strangest experiences in life is realizing that the thing you worked so hard to achieve is now the thing disconnecting you from yourself. There was a time when goals felt alive. They gave you direction, momentum, a reason to move forward. You could feel energy behind them. Effort made sense. Progress felt meaningful. But eventually, for many people, something begins to change. The same goals that once inspired you begin creating pressure. What once felt exciting now feels heavy. You keep moving, but the movement no longer feels connected to you. Achievement starts becoming mechanical. Even success begins carrying tension inside it. You reach milestones you once wanted, and instead of feeling expanded, you feel exhausted. And the strangest part is that from the outside, your life may still look successful. You may still be progressing, still producing, still achieving. But internally, something no longer feels aligned. You begin forcing yourself toward things you supposedly want. Rest starts feeling unsafe. Slowing down creates anxiety. And the goals that once served your life slowly begin organizing your life around themselves. Most people interpret this as burnout, lack of discipline, or loss of motivation. But that is usually not what is happening at all. And most people misunderstand what's actually happening here. What most people do not realize is that goals only become destructive when they stop being directional and start becoming psychological. At first, goals are natural. They emerge from curiosity, creativity, desire, or genuine movement toward life. They help organize energy. They provide orientation. But slowly, and often without noticing, something deeper begins attaching itself to them. The goal stops being something you want to experience and becomes something you need in order to feel okay. The ego begins tying identity to outcome. Success becomes connected to worth. Achievement becomes connected to safety. Control becomes connected to survival. And from that moment forward, the entire nervous system starts organizing around maintaining identity instead of remaining honest. This is the hidden shift. You are no longer moving because something feels true. You are moving because stopping feels dangerous. The body changes when this happens. There is pressure in the chest, a constant leaning into the future, an inability to fully rest. Even during success, there is subtle anxiety underneath it. Because the nervous system is no longer asking, is this aligned? It is asking that, can I survive if this fails? And once a goal becomes psychologically necessary, openness disappears. Responsiveness disappears. The system stops listening and starts defending. Effort becomes compulsive instead of intelligent. You push not because movement is natural, but because identity now depends on momentum continuing. This is why people override exhaustion, why they ignore intuition, why they stay attached to timelines that no longer fit. The body often knows long before the mind admits it. But because identity is fused with the goal, slowing down begins to feel like collapse. And this is the important reframe. The problem is not ambition, the problem is self-override. There is nothing wrong with desire. There is nothing wrong with achievement. The distortion begins the moment the goal becomes responsible for stabilizing the self. Because the moment a goal becomes psychologically necessary, you stop relating to reality clearly. You stop listening. You stop adjusting. You stop responding honestly to feedback. And this is where people begin confusing force with alignment. Once identity becomes fused with the goal, something subtle begins happening inside the nervous system. Truth slowly becomes secondary to momentum. You start ignoring signals that would normally cause you to pause. Exhaustion gets rationalized because the goal matters. Intuition gets overridden because the timeline matters. Rest begins feeling irresponsible. And over time, the body starts carrying the cost of maintaining a direction that no longer feels true. This is why people often stay in careers that no longer fit them, relationships that no longer feel alive, identities that no longer reflect who they are becoming. Not because they are incapable of change, but because the entire goal structure depends on continuity. The nervous system becomes terrified of what happens if the structure collapses. So instead of responding honestly, the system doubles down. This is where self-override becomes chronic. The body begins signaling misalignment long before the mind admits it. There is fatigue that sleep does not fix, a heaviness around things that once felt meaningful, a subtle emotional numbness. difficulty feeling joy even during achievement. But because the person is still functioning, still producing, still moving, they assume everything is fine. This is why burnout is so misunderstood. Burnout is often not a lack of capacity, it is prolonged self-abandonment. It is the accumulated exhaustion of continually overriding internal truth in order to preserve external momentum. You can see this everywhere. The entrepreneur who cannot stop working because stopping would force them to feel what has been avoided for years. The person chasing financial success while becoming increasingly disconnected from themselves, their relationships, and their body. The spiritual seeker aggressively trying to heal, improve, optimize, or transcend themselves without realizing that the aggression itself is the distortion. The high achiever who reaches every milestone they once dreamed about and still cannot relax into their own life. From the outside, these people often appear successful, but internally the nervous system is locked into maintenance mode. And this is the deeper danger of goal-driven living, when identity becomes attached to outcome. Goals stop serving life, and life begins serving the goal. The person slowly reorganizes themselves around preserving the image they believe they need to become. And in that process, something very quiet begins happening. The self is slowly abandoned in the attempt to preserve the image of who you think you need to become. But the solution is not giving up on goals altogether. The deeper solution is not to eliminate goals. It is to change your relationship with them. Because there is a profound difference between moving towards something and needing something in order to feel whole. Desire itself is not the problem. In many ways, desire is natural. It is part of how life moves, part of how creation unfolds, part of how intuition proposes direction. The problem begins when desire becomes fused with identity, when the outcome becomes responsible for stabilizing the self. Healthy desire expands the system. Distorted desire contracts it. You can feel the difference immediately in the body. When movement is aligned, there is still energy, still intention, still direction, but there is also openness. The nervous system remains responsive. You can listen, adjust, pause, change direction if necessary. The body stays available to reality instead of defending itself against it. This is what aligned movement actually feels like. Calmer, more spacious, less urgent, more honest, less defended, more responsive to what is actually happening. And importantly, this does not make a person passive. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings around alignment. People assume that if force disappears, ambition disappears with it. But aligned people are often highly engaged, highly creative, and deeply committed. The difference is that they are no longer using achievement to manufacture identity. They are no longer forcing life to confirm who they believe they need to be. This changes everything. Because intuition can only function clearly when the nervous system is not trapped in self-protection. The moment survival becomes attached to outcome, perception narrows. Reality gets filtered through fear, urgency, and control. But when identity loosens, something remarkable happens. You begin responding to reality instead of imposing yourself onto it. You stop forcing timing, you stop overriding feedback, you stop needing every outcome to validate you. And paradoxically, movement often becomes more intelligent, more effective, and more sustainable. Because force was never the source of clarity, it was compensating for the loss of it. You do not lose power when force disappears, you lose distortion. And from that place, achievement begins feeling completely different. Not because desire disappears, but because self-abandonment disappears. And this changes not only how achievement feels, but how reality responds. So for a moment, step back from the idea of achievement entirely. Not to reject it, not to abandon your goals, but simply to become honest about what your system is actually experiencing. Notice what happens in your body when you think about the thing you are pursuing most intensely right now. A relationship, money, success, recognition, healing, purpose, control. What happens internally when you bring it into awareness? Does the body open or contract? Is there spaciousness or pressure? Can you breathe fully around it? Or does your attention immediately tighten into the future? Often the body recognizes misalignment long before the mind is willing to admit it. The mind keeps negotiating, explaining, justifying, pushing forward. But the nervous system is already communicating something much more honest. Notice the subtle urgency that may be present. The feeling that you cannot fully rest until something happens. The fear that slowing down might cause everything to collapse. The sense that your worth, safety, or future depends on maintaining momentum. And just stay with that honestly for a moment, because this is where self-recognition begins. Not through analysis, not through forcing clarity, but through contact. Now ask yourself quietly, what goal currently creates contraction in my body? What am I afraid would happen if I stopped forcing? Am I pursuing this because it genuinely feels true, or because my identity depends on it? And perhaps most importantly, what would movement look like if I no longer needed the outcome to validate me? These questions matter because aligned achievement is not just about what you pursue, it is about the state you pursue it from. A nervous system trapped in pressure cannot perceive clearly. It can only defend continuity. But when pressure softens, something else becomes possible. You begin listening again, feeling again, responding again. And often what emerges is not the end of desire, but the end of distortion around it. Because many times the body already knows what is true. The mind simply keeps negotiating against it. Goals are not the problem. Desire is not the problem. Achievement is not the problem. Human beings are naturally creative, naturally directional, naturally moved toward expression, creation, expansion, and participation. The issue begins when identity becomes fused with outcome. Because the moment the self depends on achievement for stability, intelligence starts collapsing into force. Listening disappears, responsiveness disappears, and life slowly becomes organized around maintaining an image instead of remaining in contact with reality. This is why so many people eventually feel exhausted by lives they once wanted, not because desire betrayed them, but because somewhere along the way, they abandoned themselves in the pursuit of it. Real alignment is not the absence of movement, it is movement without self-betrayal. It is the ability to move towards something fully while remaining connected to yourself at the same time. To pursue without overriding, to create without collapsing into pressure, to allow goals without becoming psychologically trapped inside them. And this changes achievement completely, because when force begins dissolving, something deeper becomes available. You stop trying to dominate life into giving you certainty. You stop forcing outcomes to stabilize identity. You stop treating tension as proof of commitment. Instead, movement becomes participatory. You begin responding instead of controlling, listening instead of imposing, adjusting instead of defending. And strangely, this often creates a different relationship with reality itself, because reality responds differently to openness than it does to force. It responds differently when the nervous system is no longer locked into self-protection. What emerges from that place is not passivity, it is intelligent movement. Movement that remains honest, flexible, responsive, alive. The deeper path is not learning how to control life more effectively. It is learning how to remain connected to yourself while life unfolds, because the goal was never meant to replace your relationship with yourself. Aligned achievement begins the moment success no longer requires self-abandonment. And reality responds differently when movement no longer comes from pressure,